throwing, if we say that the Bible stories too, we're throwing away all this research and all this science. But one of the things we learned, and he mentioned paleontology, he mentioned all these science, pursuits that seemed, they would say, debunk the Bible, but they really don't. We've studied that. We've gone into, the paleontologists say that the trade secret of paleontology is there's no support for the evolutionary theory in it. And they even say that in their own meetings, that there's no support in paleontology for the evolutionary argument. And there's massive evidence to debunk the notion that these plates, say in a canyon, took millions of years to deposit. And what are those? We looked at polystrate fossils, where it goes, a tree goes through 7 million years supposed of deposition, and same way with there's vertical emplacements of fossilized animals that go through 7 million years. So there's all kinds of evidence that this pretty much dismisses the evolutionary theories on things. So they throw that away. Then they'll take something about Noah. Well, maybe it was a local flood, and they'll talk a little bit about that. And then they even had that guy doing underground radar at the Durapanar site to look for the frame. And instead of showing what they found in that framework, here's the frame of the boat of Noah. I mean, look, there's a very intricate framing assembly underground. They didn't show it. They would say, oh, they're looking at this evidence, but they wouldn't show you the evidence. It was kind of funny. You think, wait a minute, well, where is that framework? Where is it? They would turn away from that and go talk about something else. Like, oh, they're looking at it, and they'd show you a little screen you couldn't see anything on or understand, instead of showing you what they found and laying it out on the ground. So we've seen that laid out. We've seen the framework from underground radar, and it was done back in the 70s, and they laid it out. And it's people from major scientific organizations acknowledge that. So there's a lot of stuff when you see these TV shows, they just dismiss stuff. Oh, that's dismissed long ago, or that's debunked. Or one of the things they like to do is talk about, well, Moses wrote it 1,000 years after Babylonia and Gilgamesh. They talk about the story of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there was a flood story there. But they don't want to say, well, when Moses got his inspiration to write the first 5 books of the Bible, he recited God's story. And so if everyone descended from Noah, then all those tribes of the earth would have a flood story. And we've talked about that. So there's a lot of logical evidence that supports the flood story. But there's objections they keep bringing up. So I thought today I would pull together pieces of our different studies and some of the key areas and talk about answering objections and how do you do that. So, search for Noah's Ark's been around. It's, they want to call it a myth, and there's people that have gone to the Mount Ararat and done a lot of search up there, and they really don't have a lot of evidence. Every once in a while you see there's something they'll come up with from, they say it's Mount Ararat, and they think they've got a piece of wood or whatever. And but Mount Ararat's difficult to study because it's kind of got almost a glacier on top of it most of the year. Huge ice and snow up there, and then it's people who've tried to climb it say it's a very difficult climb. There's some strange stuff up there in terms of snakes and scorpions at certain times of the year. It's a very difficult trek, but the Bible account says, okay, in Genesis, we go to Genesis 6, God finds Noah righteous above his peers. God orders Noah to build this boat, and it takes 100 years to build it. Of course, there's more and more things in that the people today don't want to buy into. Well, people didn't live 900 years. How did they do that before the flood? Well, listen to the Bible's discussion of it, and you get a better picture. And he gave him the dimensions, and you think about it, he gave him the dimensions, and that was given to Moses to write up, and so it's several hundred years BC when Moses is writing this, and he's got this dimension ratio, and it turns out it's a really special ratio involved there. And so they go through the flood. God makes a promise not to destroy the world with water again. Some things change after the flood. That's basic story, but there's a lot of evidence. And this guy Ron Wyatt was an amateur archaeologist. He took people there and they studied this, and they had Turkish scientists involved at the Durpanar site. And the Turks, they're Muslim, really believe that that's the Ark. They set up a kind of a national park there, and they have it guarded, and you can, but they have a visitor center that lets you see it, because they really believe it. And so there's other places. We got some data from Ken Ham's book, on Answer's book, and one of his. And then our brotherhood is real good about the Apologetics Press. You can go there and get a lot of information. And so there's sources for this information. But one of the reasons that they'll tell you is there's no evidence of a world, the Noah story can't be true. There can't be a worldwide flood. Just don't want to believe in it. But if you go to the evidence, there's some key evidence points. One, there's fossils, marine fossils found on top of mountains all over the world, on mountaintops. How did that happen? The Grand Canyon, and if you're honest about the layers out there, you can see it was formed in a very fast deluge of mud and broken up plates, and the plate tectonics was coming apart back then. Things were happening. There's marine fossils on top of mountains. There's polystrate fossils in these layers that are supposed to have taken millions of years to deposit. You can't have a dinosaur standing upright through millions of years and wait for the depositions to hold it up. There's trees that would have rotted. In fact, that's one of the understandings we have now, is probably the reason we have any fossils at all is because the mud blanket came so fast and the deluge swamped all these creatures, and instead of going through the normal decay over 1,000 years or several thousand years and actually disintegrating, they were frozen in time. So that is a logical reason as to why we even have fossils at all, was the flood. And then there were plate tectonics breakup. This is supported by the Bible as probably continents split apart. Massive things were happening. Then the other big supporting evidence is that all these cultures have a flood story, and because they were really descended from Noah, it would make sense. So there is a lot of evidence. Let's see. Here's one of those polystrate fossils. You can see a tree. There's some others. There's one out alive. The other one's kind of an image of here's a tree. Then you go through and you ask, well, how many million years of layers is that? They'll tell you, that's 5 million years. Well, the tree didn't stand up for 5 million years and wait to rot. And there's a lot of polystrate trees in these layers, all in places. You find mud encompass a lot of fish, and you find fish fossils that are eating other fish in an instant. In an instant, they're deluged and swamped with huge mud movements, and they catch a lot of these marine animals same way as they catch the big ones. There's a sketch of where in a mine in California, they find dolomite mine. They find this vertical polystrate sea creature fossil. So there's all kinds of, and then there's another objection that they'll tell you, well, there was never a worldwide flood. We don't have any evidence of that. Well, you do have a lot of evidence. That's really not honest. Then they'll say, well, you couldn't have built an ark. Nobody could build an ark in ancient times. It's too big. It's massive. They didn't know what they were doing back in those times. Well, and men can't even build a boat that big. Yeah, they built a boat. There are 2 arks have been built as demonstration things. One, this guy, John Huber's in the Netherlands in 2011 built one. He built a half-size model, and he completed it in 2007. A half-size mile in 2007, built another in 2011, and they saw 400,000 visitors come look at it. So there's people have built arks. There's one in Kentucky now. Queen Mary was 1132 foot long, twice as long as the ark. So Titanic was 882 feet. We're talking 500 and some odd feet for an ark. So it's not impossible to think that people could build boats that big, and in ancient times they did. And then so I looked one time at how many wood planks it would take to build an ark, and I actually did the math on how many wood planks you could get out of felling a tree and just splitting it to make so many planks out of each trunk of a tree, and how many square foot of planking did it take just to make the external square footage of the ark. And it's about 115,000 square foot. If you get 5 square foot from a plank, say 6 inch by 20 foot long, and you cut down a tree and you split it, it'd take 23,000 man days to get enough square footage to do that. And if you add decking, say 3 inch thick, you'd add another 15,000 man days for the decking. And so you could have the external and external planking, internal decking in 38,000 man days. Okay, so you had 100 years. You got Noah and 3 sons, and anybody wants to hire. So the man days and the hours required to even make the thing is completely feasible. It's even with old technology that we don't know the extent of all the technology they had. We do know they had metal back then. The Bible tells us, and they had actually knowledge of iron and bronze, and we think now some other metallurgies. So it's not an impossible feat. It's not improbable, and it's perfectly capable of being done if you do the math. So men lived 900 years. Now people don't want to believe that. Okay, don't believe it. But there's evidence to support it from outside the Bible, too. We think it was about 1,700 years from creation to the flood, a little more than that. And then, again, the Bible says men did learn to work more than just bronze. And they learned iron, bronze, and some other alloys. And we think they had that technology. We've got evidence. And they would have had all manner of wood cutting tools available. And he could have hired a lot of help. And so there's a lot of evidence to support this. Perfectly feasible that a boat could be built. It's feasible that men could do it. And remember, God is involved to providentially support. So could you get all these animals in the ark? Yeah, it's got a huge volume. That's one of the reasons, or some of the reasons these guys have built these demonstration arks, and they let you tour them because it is you can have a lot of animals. Remember, the Bible didn't say they got every type, but they got all the kinds, so that you could have animals descend from those animals to make all the different breeds of dog, if you will, and so the Bible's careful to describe that way, that you can get, it could range from 35,000 to 2,000 animals and still represent all the DNA that's known. And then you don't have to get the water-based animals. They're surviving in the water, but you get the birds and all the air-breathing land animals. So we also have this melding of God's providence and miraculous support for this effort. So God can bring these animals to Noah. He doesn't have to go out and catch them all. And so there's this effort by man to support God's request that he build this, and then there's the providential support from God to give him the plans on how to build one so it would be stable. So the concept of an ark and concept of a flood, all those things are really feasible. And then we got into the Daruppanar site, like we'll talk about that everybody was looking for a 450-foot long boat, and that's using the 18-inch type cubit. And but there's one like 21 5/8 that we found later was a Royal Egyptian cubit. It was longer, and when you do that, then that's 515 feet, and it's exactly what you find at Drupanar. So there was 3 decks, about 1.5 million cubic feet. That's a lot. They seal it with pitch and tar, which again is a very viable concept. They had that back then, and that also would waterproof it. And so everything about the story of the flood in the Bible is doable and makes a lot of sense. So in 1992, the Korean University or Hydraulic Institute did a study of that proportion, the proportion ratio that God gave Noah to make the boat, and they found it was incredibly stable hydraulically. You couldn't and put it in a wave tank. It's very difficult to turn over, and they got something like over 90-foot waves. 98-foot waves could be withstood by this if it was oriented correctly into the wave. So, but you'd have to be oriented toward the direction of the wind or orthogonal to the wave if you want to keep it from capsizing sideways. So there's a question, well, how would God have told him to keep that, to do that? How do you do it? And it's not really mentioned in the Bible how they oriented, how the drifting of the ark would stay orthogonal to the wavefront, and but they found that also at the Drupanar site. But they said that stability, they tried 13 different vessels, different proportions, and this was the best for overall support and stability and safety, and combined with volume. So it was God had already optimized the design when he gave it to him. And this is, again, Moses writing it down thousands of years ago without the benefit of any of these things. And how do we know that Moses wrote that? Well, again, we've got other things we looked at, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we found, the book of Genesis, 2,000 years ago. That story in Genesis is in there and was found at least that old in ancient writings 2,000 years ago, before any of this kind of science was known. So we've got a lot to support the biblical account. So they analyzed this thing for hull strength and hydraulic stability and comfort and proportions and volume, carry volume. And they said it was just about the optimal of any design they could dream up. So, but you need a way to turn the vessel into the wind. And so there's multiple ways have been dreamed up. People said, well, there's a theory for a long time they had maybe put a weather vane on, like a fin, if you will, at the top to catch the wind and keep it turned 90 degrees. And then somebody said, well, you can put a skeg underneath it, and that'll do it too, because the water direction will straighten the boat, and as long as it's parallel to that wind flow, you can have huge waves and it not overturn it. And then when they studied that Drupanar site, it wasn't far away, they found anchor stones, and a lot of them in little villages nearby. And they're huge stones. They have a hole bored at the top, and they know in ancient times they used them. And they actually mentioned this on that TV show. But they didn't explain how the stones really worked and how clever they were. They just, it's kind of hanging there, and they kind of help stabilize. But they don't explain the brilliance of it. Because when you're in the ark, you don't care where you're going, you just want stability. So as the wind blew that ark, the stones hanging off gave it a drag effect and would orient it, exactly the direction you wanted oriented. It would be as if it were blowing backwards against the stones, and it would always keep that boat straight and orthogonal to the wave front. So it was utterly brilliant to use that. It's simple, and it takes no effort. You just hang them there, and they straighten the boat without needing a rudder underneath or a fin on top. So, and they're there, and in this region where you find all this ark, it's called the region of the eight, ancient terms. It's been called the region of the eight for as it's passed down through the centuries. So it's a lot of support that this was the site. Here's some examples of how the stones would hang loose, and the wind would blow, if you look at this blue cast shot, in the direction, coming from the stone's direction, if you will, and that would straighten the boat. And they would drag against that current, and they would keep the boat straight and parallel to the wind direction. And there's some people standing around some of this. You can see through the centuries, people knew this was the site, and they would come carve Christian crosses on these stones, knowing that they were, or feeling that they were of holy origin. They were representative of God's support of mankind, and so they'll have 8 crosses carved on them, 2 big ones, and one really big one, and then another pretty big one, and then 3 smaller ones, and then 3 even smaller ones to represent Noah's sons and his sons' wives. So these were discovered. They finally, people woke back up to this in the 70s through this work of this amateur archaeologist, and that was a fascinating discovery about, well, how would you keep this boat turned into the wind so it would be stable, and that they found that there. So there's objections, and the site in Turkey was found a long time ago, and a NATO pilot found it. We say it's found. I mean, the people locally believed it for centuries, so thousands of years. So, but in modern era, we find it in 1959. So, oh, look at that! It looks like a boat. That's strange. Why would that be up 5,000-foot elevation? So people dismissed it in about 1960. They did a study, or 61. And and one of the things they did dismiss it over, it wasn't the right length. They said they're looking for 450 feet, 18 inch times 300, and so everybody, it can't be it, and it's wider. Well, so they just blew it off. That's probably not it, the boat. It's just some natural formation. Well, when people went back to rediscover and study it in the 70s and maybe the late 60s, they saw this guy, Ryan White, said, well, wait a minute, there's another cubit that could be used, and the guy who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Moses, he was raised as an Egyptian pharaoh. So he would know the royal Egyptian cubit was 21 and 5/8 inches. So when you do that math, you get exactly 515 feet, which is how long this thing is. So people that ignored that point, and they found these cubit rods in you can see that boat type shape, and this thing never works. People don't see it, but it's right there. And they found it. And it was the right length. If you use a Royal Egyptian cubit, it's a little wider because, the framework is splayed open from damage, but it all made a lot of sense. And people just hadn't looked. They hadn't paid enough attention, hadn't done enough. But this Royal Egyptian cubit is found in different tombs of Egyptian royalty, and it's longer than the 18-inch cubit. And it was like it was almost a sign of royalty or favor from the king, the pharaoh, when you had one of those and you carried it or used it as kind of an emblem of your connection to power. And it would be found in the tombs of the royalty, or servants, close servants of the royalty, and they measured it. And there's several of them. It's 21 inches. So why would that boat-shaped thing be up there? And near it is a monument of stone. There's a tele-type monument, and it shows some depictions, and it's all broken up. No one knows exactly how old that thing is, but and it shows a depiction of the 8 and depiction of the birds, and a depiction of the mountains behind it and the ark and the people, and it's got a. So nobody really knows when that was carved, but it's broken up now. And then they got to looking at the site and they found ribs, like fossilized ribs. And then they brought ground penetrating radar back in the 70s at the level they had it, and they found the ribbing. And they framed it up and explained, okay, here's the horizontal members, here's the linear members, the axial members. This thing was a framework of man. Somebody built this. And then they found there's a site where it looks like it's set down higher up the mountain, about 1.5 miles away, and it looks like lava flow from the volcano pushed it down lower to where it is now. So there's a setting point up high that has like the bottom part of the ark and some of the things that were in the ballast probably of the ark, and then 1.5 miles away is the leftover upper framework. So it all makes a lot of sense when you open up your mind and look at it. That's a picture of it, and you can see, and they've had various earthquakes over there that have opened up the dirt and let you see the framework, because they don't like you excavating there, but they will let you do GP, underground radar. And so that's the sort of view of it here. And it got impaled on that ridge of stone when it slid down from the mountain up above in the lava flow. And so it got it impaled, and that's where it stopped. So it halted the flow, and we believe it's probably what happened, how it got where it is. Here's what is that? There's some of where the dirt came off from kind of earthquake situation. You could see this part of the fossilized framework of the beams. They found some strange stuff there too. They found, when they laid it out, they found cross members, the linear members. They found a framework of a boat. Somebody built this. It's not accidental, and they shared it. It was on TV. It was on 2020 back in the late 70s. People saw it and they kind of, well, okay. But I don't think enough attention was paid that this is probably it. And that's on that stone telly up there. It's kind of a stone monument. It's all broken up, and this is the image that there's a couple of birds, background mountains, and then this boat, and then 8 faces. So that's, and don't really know how old that is or when it was built. It's 1,000 years old or 500, nobody knows. But the people in that era knew that as the region of the 8. Here's the leftovers of that stone monument that they found there. You can see that bird in that one of those stone depictions. There's the bird, one of the birds there, and so it's fascinating that they had a monument to the ark there 1,000 years ago. Who knows? So we said it's set down there at one side. It looks like there's smelting rocks that they may have used for ballast when Noah smelted his metals, because they also found rivets that nobody was expecting, of an alloy content that nobody was expecting there. And God said those people had learned to use metallurgy. They learned bronze and iron, and knew a lot of things about metallurgy, and they had smelt it and use the metal and make the alloy and make the rivets. It's fascinating to watch what happened there. And they found out in the belly, and these strange rocks with these trace minerals in them and trace metals, and they figured those were the smelting rocks, and they used that for ballast, and that's why it's parked 1.5 miles higher, where the ark probably set down first, and then when the lava hit it, it just broke that off and left that there and moved the rest of it down with the lava, they think. So fascinating study. They found these rivets. Nobody was looking for that. Modern man didn't even have alloys of steel and aluminum as a common alloy. In the last few years, somebody invented one, and they found that if you alloy it just right with titanium, manganese, some other things, you can get a very strong and light alloy that is also corrosion resistant. which is kind of fascinating because he needed something to last a year, and fascinating things they're learning. Some Koreans invented an alloy that sort of mirrors that recently. There's one of what the rivets look like. And I was fascinated by that. Nobody knew that. But they've known this for 45 years. They discovered that back in the 70s. But nobody on TV will tell you all about this stuff. And that was the composition of the alloy. We looked at that one time. When you ratio it up, you can get a 50-40 9-in-1 alloy of ferroaluminum. And now ferroaluminum is an alloy that people sell as specialty metals, which is kind of unusual. So there's cultural and linguistic support, and we talked about that a lot, that and you go to Bible, Genesis 10, we've got the table of nations, and you can see who settled where and which nations came from each of Noah's sons. Mizraim is the word that's used for Egypt, and that's there. Then they say, well, the Chinese must be descendants. If everybody's descendant of Noah, everybody is. Well, the Chinese, we found these Chinese characters you can find, and you go on the internet, that they use the term boat and ate, and to get flood. And there's some fascinating things that the Chinese characters tell us, that they also are descended from Noah, and they also have the story, and they too are Noah's children. That's the ancient Chinese character for boat. It's a vessel, and then the word eight, and then people. Why would that be a name for a boat? Why would eight get in there? If you want to make a boat, you have to have, 6 sides at least, right? Or 5, okay, at least 5, okay? But you don't have 8. You don't need 8. So 8 has nothing to do with a boat except in the Noah story. So it's fascinating that would be in the Chinese history. And then the flood, the word for flood is water plus total plus, and total is together plus earth plus 8. He's got 8 in there. Why does the Chinese word for flood have 8 in it? It has because they are descended from Noah, just like we are. And so there's all these cultural and linguistic clues, and to me it's utterly fascinating, and they don't tell you about it in the mainstream media. That's the same thing again. Let's see. Could men have built the boat? Yeah. Would it have been stable? You bet. Stable by modern technology. Could it have? That's the way, if you look at a super tanker with oil, it's got about that ratio now, width, height, and length. Could it have enough room for animals, men? Oh, yeah. Did they possess the technology to construct a boat? Oh, you bet. Could God have inspired the animals to come miraculously to the site? Miraculously, yeah, provided that. God have controlled the weather, the earth plates, the water level, yeah. Could the fact that it is true be the reason there's an ark story in all the cultures? You can get many lessons from the ark and from the story of Noah. But one of them is fascinating, is God uses man's skill and combined with his providence to produce a profound thing. But he uses the men to do things. The righteous were protected while most rejected warnings. The destruction of mankind was real and tragic. It did not have to happen. Noah preached for 100 years. If God does not ask of you what you cannot do, he'll help you. Obedience to God is often accompanied by objections from disbelievers, still is. God allows man to make his choice as to his destiny, and the way of faith is not always easy. And we know that from Matthew. Even the Sermon on the Mount tells us that. So there's a few other things, but we'll wrap it up. These two guys were not educated, and they built the first flight machine. There was a guy competing with them, Professor Langley, who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, and he had government funding, and he was trying to build a flying machine. And I think his crashed twice and never got anything working. And That's his picture, Langley, with his guy. They were heavily funded federally, and they couldn't get a plane to fly. But these two poor preacher's kids got one built. That's the guy, Heinrich Schlemmer, that found Troy, and everybody said he couldn't find Troy. He's a rich guy, amateur archaeologist, and he found Troy. They kept excavating. So it's okay to like growing things, like Noah. It's okay to be fascinated with boats. It's okay to want to be kind to animals. It's okay to like building things out of wood. It's okay to feel a kinship with all mankind, because you are, and it's okay to want to warn people about God's wrath and tell them about God's love. It's okay. It's in your DNA.